When things don't turn out as hoped, how do you explain that to yourself? Do you just accept it and not think much of it? Or do you start to tell yourself stories to rationalize why things are the way they are and why you are the way that you are? You're listening to Pure Light, where we explore how to become the highest version of yourself so that you feel worthy of your craziest dreams and confident in your power to make them happen. My name is Ailey. I'm a coach and a Kundalini yoga and meditation teacher. This is episode 43, and it's about the stories we tell ourselves, but not others. I'm going to share one of those stories with you from my own life. It's one that I kept mostly to myself for a very long time. The stories that we tell ourselves really help us define who we are in a way. And ironically, it doesn't always serve us. It sometimes gets in the way of us having what we want in our lives. And this is definitely one of those stories. So when I was in high school, I really wanted to be in a relationship. So not just dating, but actually boyfriend, girlfriend. And I didn't want to be single. I did not enjoy being single. Being single made me feel like there was something wrong with me because someone hadn't chosen me. And I would look at the people around me who were in relationships and look at how I was different from them. And this was usually a physical thing because I had major body image issues. So I would look at, the fact that my thighs were bigger or my hair was curly or like whatever it was. And that would become the list of reasons that I would blame for the fact that I was single. And it was like a pretty long list. And this is something that started when I was a teenager, like when I was in high school. And even though I ended up in a long-term relationship in my 20s, that insecurity was still there. So it never really went away even when I had the relationship because the story just became a little bit different. So instead of using those things that I didn't like about myself as reasons for not being in a relationship, I began to use them as reasons to explain why my relationship wasn't progressing to the next level. And I think the only person that I shared this story with was a friend in high school who was also single for a lot of high school. So, I did date a little bit in high school and I ended up in a relationship towards the end. But for the better part of it, I was single. And so this story was really deeply entrenched in me. It felt like a part of me and it felt like it was just a fact of life. Like it was the truth. Like this is why I'm single. And this is why my relationship isn't progressing. And years later, so after my relationship in my 20s ended, when I went backpacking in Australia, I was traveling with a friend for a few months. And at one point we ended up woofing in Mount Surprise, which is a tiny town in the outback. So it's a little bit inland from the Great Barrier Reef. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere. It has a population of about 70. And if you've never heard of woofing, it stands for Willing Workers on Organic Farms. And it's like a work exchange. So basically you work for a certain number of hours per day in exchange for room and board. So it can be like a really interesting and budget-friendly way to travel and see things that you normally wouldn't and have some different experiences. And for this particular host, for this farm, for this woofing assignment, we'd had some communication issues because the phone signal can be a bit wonky in the remote parts, and this was definitely remote. And the friend that I was traveling with had been the one communicating with the host. So I didn't really have a lot of information about, what we were getting into other than where we were going and like the fact that he had like a fruit stand. And so when we got there, we found out that the host had actually not planted his organic garden that year because he'd been too busy because he was hosting a camp for 15 construction workers who were working on building a bridge nearby. So there were 15 men who, most of whom were like 20 to 40 years old, living on this farm in temporary housing. And as it turned out, our responsibilities would be more focused on helping take care of them as opposed to doing the organic farming and fruit stand stuff that we thought we were going to do. And so what ended up happening during the time that we were there, I think it was like a few days or almost a week, the men, they were obviously starved for female attention because there was like no one in that town and there were so many of them. And some of them were married and in relationships, but a lot of them were single. And so when we arrived, it was like this dose of female energy that they hadn't had in a long time. And while we were there, like several of the men ended up being interested in me. And this was like, I think I had let go of my story at that point because of some other stuff that had happened. But it was interesting because the friend that I was traveling with, she noticed that there were several men who were interested in spending time with me and getting my attention. And then she also felt like there weren't as many who were interested in her attention, or not to the same level. And I remember having this conversation one day where she almost started crying, and she was like telling me the same story that I had been telling myself for all those years. So it was basically like, you are getting this attention because you look like this and I look like that, and I'm never going to look like that because this is just how I was born. And it was literally the exact same story I had told myself for all those years, but just with different details. Because, you know, my friend and I did not look alike at all, but it was the same story. And I just remember being like, what the fuck? This is crazy. Because it made me realize that the story wasn't personal. Like, it had felt personal my entire life because it was about me. It was about what was wrong with me. But hearing someone else say it with different details made me realize that it really wasn't personal. It was more about our perception of things than it was about the way that things actually are. So it wasn't really about our bodies or what we look like. It was about the perception that there was something wrong with that. So the stories that we tell ourselves may seem personal, but they're not. They're the defense mechanisms that we use to protect ourselves from change. And they're the things that we use also to keep ourselves stuck in the prison of past conditioning. So they keep us stuck because they reinforce why things are the way they are. And so when opportunities come up for things to be different than the way that they are, we end up limiting those possibilities because of the beliefs that we have based on the stories that we tell ourselves. So they prevent us from even seeing or considering a different path. And when we struggle with something, we tend to explain it to ourselves to try to make sense of it. And when we do that, the story usually has something to do with how the world is, or how we are, and why we are the way that we are. And when we do that, we give power to those stories. So we give our decision-making authority to those stories in a way, because like, I know for me, when I was in high school, at one point, my sister was like, oh, these guys on the water polo team are interested in you. And I did not believe her because they were like hot. They had 6-pack abs. And I was just like, I was not open to that possibility at the time, even though I would have wanted it, because I did not feel worthy because of this story I'd been telling myself. So I think that the thing that's important to notice here is that the stories are often automatic and they can be negative. And when they're negative and personal, it really has a major impact on our sense of self and on our self-worth. So it's important to notice whenever you're telling yourself a story, because if you can go into something with an open mind and without any assumptions or preconceived ideas of what should happen or why things are the way that they are or how things are supposed to be, you can really go in with an open heart and an open mind. And in so doing, open yourself up to new possibilities. So if you are finding yourself telling yourself stories, especially stories that you would not want to share with others, I think that's probably one of the biggest signs. You need to start asking yourself some questions like, is this really true? And is it possible that this is just a story that I'm telling myself? Because there's a good chance that it is. So when you catch yourself telling yourself stories, especially stories that you would not want to tell other people, it's not a sign that there's something wrong with you. It's a sign that you need to question the story and ask yourself, is this really true? Or am I only allowing myself to see evidence of the fact that this is true? Like, is there evidence of the fact that this may not be true that I'm ignoring? Because I think it's when we start to open our minds to new possibilities that we start to see that maybe things aren't the way that we've been thinking that they are, and maybe it is just the story that's been keeping them that way. I think one of the things that can trigger these stories in ourselves is jealousy. Because when someone else has what we want that we don't, we look for reasons to explain that. And the reasons often end up being negative because we're trying to explain why we don't deserve the thing that we want. So I'm going to talk about the upside of jealousy in the next episode and how to use it for personal growth instead of a reason to beat yourself up. To make sure you don't miss it, subscribe wherever you're listening. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, may you be guided by your light.